Well, I recently saw a clip of a Joe Rogan podcast in which Matt Walsh was the guest and they were having a conversation about marriage. And Walsh was defending traditional notions and definitions of marriage, while Rogan was challenging him on that, calling to mind a variety of examples which don't fit into Walsh's definition of marriage.
What about people that get married that don't have kids? Are you opposed to that? What if they get married, they decide, you know what, we don't need kids, I'm going to get fixed. You get your tubes tied, let's travel the world. Right? If marriage is only for procreation and to bond a family together, what about people that are deeply in love that never want to have children?
I don't think it's not only procreation, but that is one of the fundamental definitional aspects of it. Of course, there's more to marriage just than that.
And what about people that are infertile? They fall in love and they realize that they can't have babies. And they don't really necessarily want to adopt. Is that okay for them to be married? Because then by definition, marriage falls into a completely different thing. Because then it's a bond of love. It's a union of love.
Now, this is a rhetorical tactic that has been used to great success to dismantle a thing that might be considered conventional, in this case, the traditional understanding or definition of marriage, and assail it with examples of exceptions to the rule or to the definition. And it's been employed, I would say, in an accelerated way in the modern era by those who want to establish their own explanatory ideas and definitions, and I would even say ideologies. But instead of taking us through the logical steps that lead to their conclusions, they deconstruct something that already exists, seemingly in the hopes of establishing themselves as some kind of an authority who can now propose their own alternative ideology. Now, I suppose that method takes some intellectual ingenuity, but I'm much more impressed with a thinker who can observe something that is common to all of our experiences, that is relevant to all of our experiences, and then give us tools of thinking to understand it more comprehensively and rationally. Take, for example, an explorer who wants to map out a geographical region, which is something we all have experience of. We're all familiar with land and trees and bodies of water, and those contribute to our everyday experiences. But an explorer who thoroughly marks out a region and creates a map from it has taken our everyday experiences and made something cultured and rational out of it, which is then extremely useful for us to understand what it is that we have everyday experiences of. Now, trace that back to systems of thought that great thinkers like Aristotle and Plato and St. Thomas Aquinas have contributed in their work. They look at our experiences that are common to us, like we perceive things in our everyday life, and then we sort of categorize them and organize them in our minds, which seem to correlate to something about the essence of those things. Well, let's call those things substances, and let's call their essences something like forms or universals or maybe even souls. What they're doing is initiating a line of inquiry that traces those everyday experiences and creates a rational account of them that can be built upon to understand them more deeply. And the result is something like a map of understanding. Now, a map is always going to be somewhat imperfect and susceptible to criticism, right? Because it will never be as real as the real thing. It will always be a concept of the real thing, and as a result, someone could always come along and say, well, this is missing a tree, or this lake is actually 10 feet wider, or they could say that this is now outdated because we've discovered some things that the original map maker may have missed. And from that kind of deconstruction, a person of ill will could say, oh, you're so out of fashion for following that original map. Or a person of envy or a person who wants to supplant the map maker as an authority can, with enough polemical ferocity, convince people to just throw the map away altogether. And in terms of systems of thought, they can say things like, oh, you like Plato, do you? Did you know that Plato believed that women's wombs could become nomadic and travel around their bodies and cause them to become hysterical? Or, oh, you like Aristotle? Did you know that Aristotle believed that the sun revolved around the earth and that some people were naturally born to be slaves? I don't know why you would listen to people like that. And then after having convinced you to abandon Plato and Aristotle and whoever else, or the map and the map maker because of its imperfections, they then propose their own map, which they consider superior, without ever having told you that they relied on Plato or Aristotle or the map maker to develop their own map all along. Think about what this does in your relationship to the information. They benefited from this tradition, from the original map, And they don't want you to have access to that so that they can then sell you the map that they only know about, that they've created themselves, and be a wedge and a barrier and a middleman between you and that great tradition. And this has been a revolutionary tactic for as long as that spirit has been successful. Luther used it in the Protestant Reformation by deconstructing Catholicism, but without ever offering a coherent alternative. Luther rightly perceived corruptions and abuses that existed and have always existed in an institution curated by sinners, which doctrinally recognizes that we are composed of sinners and there will always be problems in the church, and eventually just dismissed the whole thing as corrupt instead of the corruptions within an otherwise necessary and good thing. Enlightenment philosophers who wanted to establish science as the preeminent form of thought and inquiry did it with metaphysics and ethics by using metaphysics and ethics to dismiss them as the domain of philosophers and clerics, whereas the real important work to be done is in the natural and the physical sciences. French revolutionaries did it to overthrow the monarchy and the church, and more recently Marx did it to overthrow, I guess, everything, or wanted to overthrow everything. And more recently, it has been done to overthrow the institution of marriage. You look at a thing that has been defined and mapped out, and then you say, well, what about this? And what about that? And you highlight exceptions and call into question the definition. And then once the definition is cracked open, you smuggle in your own version without ever having to rise to the challenge of establishing a coherent definition of your own. They're now doing it with gender without ever being able to answer such a simple question like, well, what is a woman? So to return to Rogan's line of challenges against the traditional definition of marriage, well, as an analogy, what if I tried to define what a dog was? And I said, well, a dog is a carnivorous, four-legged mammal with fur, non-retractable claws, a tail, and is highly superior to the cat. And you said, well, what about dogs that are born with only 3 legs or alopecia and therefore don't have fur? Or what about dogs who lost all their teeth and now all they can eat is fruit smoothies? Are they not dogs? Because your definition doesn't seem to include them. That's what Rogan is doing with Walsh's definition of marriage. He's saying, well, what about people who can't have kids or don't want to have kids? What about people who can't consummate their marriage? Or what about people who are too old to have kids? And from that, we can apparently just throw out the whole definition of marriage. It's like, no, those are exceptions or unfortunate cases that fall short of the ideal, but that doesn't mean that the ideal doesn't serve as the aim for what we should want to see in marriage. Just like a whole and healthy dog is one with 4 legs and all of its teeth. Because there are exceptions to that definition and still be a dog, it doesn't mean that we dismiss the whole definition of dog and let you propose that your actually inferior cat is a dog. Yes, some couples who fit the traditional criteria of a marriage can't have kids because something that should be there isn't there, but they're still ordered towards that end if everything was working. The fact that sometimes things can fail or be missing doesn't mean that we now have to throw away the whole concept of something like a marriage and say that we can define it to be whatever we want it to be, especially considering no alternative coherent definition has been offered. We've just said, well, because there are exceptions, let's allow our artificially imposed and contrived exceptions, which is incoherent at best. Deconstructing something that is imperfect and flawed is fine as long as it's in the service of refining the concept. So if a map is missing a few meters of coastline, well, let's discover that, let's analyze it, and then let's draw them in if that's what we conclude. And if someone comes along and says, hey, let's just throw the map away, and while we're at it, I just happen to have a new map of my own, that's someone that we should be wary of. Hey, thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you are able to support the work I'm doing, there are a couple of ways you can do that: by donating through my website or by joining my online community, The Reinforcements. Both can be done by visiting brianholdsworth.ca, the .ca because that's how we internet in Canada. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. And again, thanks for watching.